On January 26, 1945, in Holtzwihr, France, a soldier from the 2nd Mountain Division of the German Army observed through the infirmary window as the wounded were brought in by the medical staff. His unit had just launched an assault with 250 men and 6 tanks against a solitary American lieutenant who stood defiantly atop a burning tank destroyer. This lone American warrior was armed with just one machine gun. Within the span of an hour, the German fighting force was decimated, leaving only 70 capable soldiers. The survivors could speak of nothing but the singular weapon that had brought their advance to a standstill. This was not some clandestine wonder weapon, nor a product of German ingenuity born in their laboratories, but rather a straightforward American machine gun, a model that had first rolled off the assembly lines in 1933. Nevertheless, this weapon, the Browning M250 caliber heavy machine gun, was destined to become the most formidable piece of equipment in the American military's inventory. Its notoriety stemmed not from its intricate design, but from its raw, unyielding efficacy. The German survivors had just witnessed an event that would etch itself into the annals of American military history as one of its most legendary engagements. First Lieutenant Audie Murphy, despite sustaining injuries and fighting alone, had clambered aboard a blazing M10 tank destroyer. From there, he had pivoted its turret-mounted 50 caliber machine gun, unleashing a torrent of fire upon an entire German infantry company, which was supported by armored vehicles. For more than 60 minutes, Murphy operated the weapon with such devastating precision that the German assault simply dissolved. The official commendation for the Medal of Honor, bestowed by Lieutenant General Alexander Patch on June 2, 1945, verified that Murphy had inflicted approximately 50 casualties upon the attacking enemy force. The wounds, inflicted by 50 caliber projectiles, became a grimly familiar sight for German medical personnel. Unlike standard rifle rounds that might cause injury and allow for recovery, 50 caliber rounds inflicted catastrophic tissue damage. The immense transfer of kinetic energy meant that a hit to a limb frequently necessitated amputation. A strike to the torso was almost invariably fatal. German field hospitals situated near the front lines soon learned to identify casualties from 50 caliber fire by the distinctive nature of their injuries. There was little the medical staff could do beyond offering solace and attempting to stabilize patients for evacuation. Many of the wounded never even reached the field hospitals. The impact of this weapon extended beyond the immediate physical casualties. German units subjected to sustained 50 caliber fire experienced psychological trauma, combat exhaustion, and a breakdown in unit cohesion at rates far exceeding those that engaged conventional small arms. Medical officers observed that soldiers who had endured repeated 50 caliber bombardments, even when physically unscathed, exhibited profound signs of severe stress and battle fatigue. The chilling realization that the next burst of fire could not be survived through mere cover, that one's survival was dictated by luck rather than skill, fostered a sense of utter helplessness that held significant medical and military consequences. However, the engagement at Holtzwihr was not an isolated occurrence. From the Bocage country of Normandy to the frigid woodlands of the Ardennes, from the arid deserts of North Africa to the very skies above the Reich itself, German soldiers grew to recognize and dread a distinct sound. It was the deep, resonant thunder of the M2 Browning unleashing its fury at a rate of 450 to 575 rounds per minute. Each colossal 50 caliber projectile carried sufficient energy to pierce light armor, obliterate concrete structures, and reduce human bodies to unrecognizable fragments. The transition from skepticism to outright terror had commenced 3 years prior. The sheer industrial might of America was about to be quantified not in production figures, but in the harrowing experiences of German soldiers who had faced this weapon and survived to recount their tales. What they discovered would shatter their understanding of modern warfare and reveal a profound truth about American military strategy. The United States had not developed the most intricate heavy machine gun. They had forged something far more perilous. They had created the most dependable, the most widespread, and the most psychologically devastating crew-served weapon in history. The animosity began not with fear, but with disdain. On September 6, 1943, the skies above Stuttgart, 388 B-17 flying fortresses approached Germany's industrial heartland, marking the first significant daylight raid on the city. Luftwaffe fighter units scrambled to intercept. Among them were seasoned pilots who had downed dozens of Allied aircraft over 2 years of combat. They held a confident belief in their Focke-Wulf 109 aircraft, each armed with 4 20-millimeter cannons and 2 13-millimeter machine guns. The German pilots initiated their attack runs from an elevated position ahead of the bombers, a standard tactic for intercepting the American heavy aircraft. At 800 meters, they opened fire. Cannons roared. Shells streaked towards the lead bombers. Then something occurred that would forever alter the German perception of aerial combat. The bombers erupted with fire. This was not the smoke of damaged aircraft, but the muzzle flashes of their own weapons. Each B-17 carried 13 Browning M2 machine guns. A typical formation of 36 bombers meant a staggering 468 heavy machine guns, all firing the identical 50 caliber Browning cartridge, capable of reaching out to 1,830 meters with lethal effect. The combined defensive firepower of the formation surpassed 6,000 rounds per minute, creating a veritable wall of steel that no fighter could safely penetrate. German fighters felt their aircraft shudder as 50 caliber rounds tore through wings, engine cowlings, and canopies. They broke off their attacks, diving away with aircraft trailing plumes of smoke and leaking hydraulic fluid. The raid exacted a heavy toll on the Luftwaffe. 45 B-17s were lost, but the German fighter losses were catastrophic, particularly for units that could no longer readily replace their experienced pilots. What the German pilots failed to grasp at that moment was that they were not merely encountering a weapon, but a fundamental philosophy of warfare. The Americans had solved the challenge of bomber defense, not through technological sophistication, but through the sheer, overwhelming volume of their fire. Each B-17G carried between 5,000 and 7,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, distributed across 13 gun positions, with some crews even augmenting their ammunition beyond regulatory limits. Luftwaffe pilots had been conditioned to respect 20mm and 30mm cannons, as these weapons possessed the capability to destroy a bomber with a single, well-aimed shot. They had learned to dread the explosive rounds that detonated on impact, but the American .50 caliber round did not explode. It did not need to. The massive, half-inch diameter projectile, weighing 707 grains and traveling at 2,900 feet per second, delivering 12,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy, simply punched through anything it struck: wings, engines, fuel tanks, pilots. By October 1943, Luftwaffe fighter units had begun to comprehend the true extent of the danger. Oberleutnant Heinrich Wormhela, an ace credited with 93 victories, described the American bomber formations in a letter to his family. "To attack the Americans," he wrote, "is to fly through a storm of steel." You see the tracers, 1 round in 5, and you know that for every tracer you see, 4 more bullets you cannot see are flying past. When you close to effective cannon range, you are already inside their killing zone. The Germans adapted their tactics. They attempted head-on assaults, dives from above, climbs from below, and attacks from the sides. Nothing proved consistently effective. The American gunners had overlapping fields of fire. If you approached from the front, the nose guns and top turret would engage. From the rear, the tail guns and ball turret. From the sides, the waist guns. From above or below, the ball turret and top turret. There was simply no safe approach. The United States Army Air Forces had meticulously arranged their combat box formations of 18 to 21 aircraft in 3-dimensional space, specifically to maximize overlapping fields of defensive fire. But the true horror was not merely the volume of fire. It was the absolute reliability. German pilots flying the Messerschmitt Bf 109 or Focke-Wulf 190 knew that their cannons were prone to jamming, especially in the frigid air at high altitudes. The German MG 131 13mm machine gun was superior, but it still demanded meticulous maintenance and could fail at critical junctures. The American Browning M2, in stark contrast, simply performed. It fired continuously for hours. It operated in temperatures ranging from -40 to +40 degrees Celsius. It functioned even after being struck by German cannon fire. It kept shooting even as its barrels glowed red from sustained firing. American maintenance crews would replace overheated barrels in mere minutes, not hours, and the gun would resume its deadly work without missing a beat. Lieutenant Wolfgang Fischer, a Junkers Jew Ada-8 pilot who undertook bomber intercept missions over the Reich, survived the war to provide testimony during post-war Luftwaffe debriefings. His words, recorded in March 1946, captured the growing apprehension among German aircrews. We called the American bomber formations Die Fliegenden Festungen, the flying fortresses, he recalled. But what made them true fortresses was not their armor or their formation discipline. It was those .50 caliber machine guns that never stopped firing, never jammed, never gave us an opening. We lost so many pilots, not to American fighters, but to the bomber defensive fire. It was like flying into a meat grinder. The ground war echoed the same narrative, albeit with different details. On June 6, 1944, in Normandy, Oberst Hans von Luck commanded elements of the 21st Panzer Division, tasked with defending against the Allied invasion. Von Luck was no ordinary officer. He had fought at El Alamein, earned the Knight's Cross, and would later publish his acclaimed memoir, Panzer Commander. His division was among the first German units to engage American forces in sustained ground combat. What von Luck discovered was that American doctrine had integrated the 50 caliber machine gun onto virtually every combat vehicle. Jeeps mounted them, trucks mounted them, half-tracks mounted them, tanks carried them on their turret roofs, tank destroyers were equipped with them, and even supply vehicles bore them for convoy protection. The Americans had achieved a feat that the Germans had never even contemplated: universal heavy machine gun coverage across their entire force structure. Von Luck wrote in his memoir about the tactical implications. "We had been told our training and our tactical doctrine would overcome American material advantage," he stated. "At Normandy, I learned the truth. The Americans did not need superior tactics. They had enough ammunition to make mistakes and still win." Their 50 caliber machine guns were on every vehicle, every position, firing continuously. We could not move in daylight. Any attempt to maneuver drew immediate and overwhelming fire. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical casualties. The German army had built its infantry doctrine around the machine gun. The MG-34 and its successor, the MG-42, were exceptional weapons. The MG-42 fired at 1,200 rounds per minute, earning it the moniker Hitler's buzzsaw from Allied soldiers who heard its distinctive sound. German squads carried 1,800 rounds per machine gun and organized their tactics around supporting the gun crew. The concept, known as Einheitsmaschinengewehr, or general-purpose machine gun, would later be adopted by NATO forces due to its tactical soundness. However, the Germans had never envisioned the sheer scale of American 50 caliber deployment. A single American armored division advancing through France would possess hundreds of 50 caliber machine guns mounted on its vehicles. American supply convoys employed a documented tactic of alternating fire. One vehicle would fire to the right, the next to the left, thereby covering both flanks and disrupting German ambushes. This tactic proved particularly effective against Panzerjäger teams attempting to engage American armor at close range. American armored columns utilized what they termed reconnaissance by fire. Instead of advancing cautiously and waiting for the enemy to reveal their positions, American units would continuously fire their 50 caliber machine guns into any suspicious area. Tree lines, farm buildings, stone walls, hedges. The sheer volume of fire would either suppress hidden German positions or provoke return fire, thereby revealing their locations. This tactic, extensively documented in primary sources including Tank Tactics from Normandy to Lorraine by Roman Jari Moksulski, drove German soldiers to distraction. German infantry veterans of the Eastern Front believed they had experienced the worst of industrial warfare against the Soviets. Then they encountered American firepower doctrine in France. German squad leaders who survived the fighting in Normandy and were taken prisoner described the difference in their debriefings, preserved in the United States Army Historical Division files. Against the Russians, we faced human wave attacks and artillery barrages, one debriefing stated. Against the Americans, we faced machine gun fire that never stopped. They fired at everything. They fired at nothing. They fired to make us keep our heads down. They fired to prevent us from moving. They fired because they had unlimited ammunition and we did not. After 2 weeks of combat in the bocage, soldiers would refuse to leave cover during daylight hours. It was not cowardice. It was mathematics. movement meant death. The M16 multiple gun motor carriage exemplified American firepower philosophy in its most extreme form. This was a half-track mounting 450 caliber machine guns in a powered turret, originally designed for anti-aircraft defense. The combined rate of fire approached 2,200 rounds per minute. American soldiers referred to it as the meat chopper or the kraut mower. Official reports from the 473rd Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion in November 1944 stated that the primary mission of the M16 half-track, often anti-aircraft, frequently became secondary, and it was instead employed against ground troops. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had been largely defeated over Western Europe. American anti-aircraft units found themselves repurposed for ground support operations. The M16 proved devastatingly effective against German infantry and light vehicles. During the Battle of the Bulge, when German forces launched their last major offensive in the West from December 16, 1944 to January 25, 1945, M16 units were credited with breaking up numerous German infantry attacks simply by traversing their four-gun mounts across advancing formations. The experiences of German forces attempting to ambush American supply convoys illustrate why the .50 caliber weapon became so loathed. German doctrine for convoy ambushes dictated allowing the lead vehicles to pass, then destroying vehicles in the middle of the column to create a roadblock, and subsequently systematically destroying the trapped convoy. This tactic had proven effective against British and Soviet supply lines earlier in the war. Against American convoys, however, the tactic failed catastrophically. American convoy doctrine strategically placed .50 caliber armed vehicles at intervals throughout the column. When an ambush was initiated, American vehicles would immediately return fire with their .50 calibers, while other vehicles maneuvered to flank the ambush position. The sheer volume of return fire was so intense that German ambush teams frequently suffered heavier casualties than the convoys they attacked. German platoon leaders who participated in convoy ambushes during the fighting in France described the evolution of German tactics and their ultimate failure in post-war interrogations. In early ambushes, German forces positioned infantry with machine guns and Panzerfausts along roads. American convoys had vehicles equipped with .50 caliber machine guns distributed throughout. The volume of return fire from the convoys was devastating. German units learned to only ambush isolated vehicles, never convoys, but isolated vehicles were a rarity. The Americans moved in strength precisely because they knew German forces could not effectively attack their convoys. The pattern of alternating fire that American convoys employed was particularly effective. Vehicles on the right side of the road would fire into the right flank. Vehicles on the left would fire left. This created intersecting fields of fire that covered both sides of the road simultaneously. German forces attempting to ambush from one side would find themselves under fire, not only from that side of the convoy, but also from the opposite side. The psychological impact of being under fire from multiple directions by weapons that could penetrate cover and possessed seemingly unlimited ammunition made successful ambushes nearly impossible. American logistics units understood that the .50 caliber machine gun was their primary defense. Drivers and assistant drivers received training on the weapons, Ammunition was loaded in quantities far exceeding official allocations. Convoy commanders were authorized to engage any suspected threat with immediate and overwhelming fire. The result was that German forces, by mid to late 1944, had largely abandoned attempts to interdict American supply lines in areas where American forces possessed air superiority and sufficient ground combat power to respond to attacks. This had strategic implications extending far beyond the immediate tactical situation. German forces in France and later in Germany itself could not effectively interrupt American logistics. American units could rely on regular resupply of ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment. This meant that American tactical planning could assume that firepower would be readily available when needed. German planning, conversely, had to account for chronic ammunition shortages, fuel shortages, and the certainty that any supplies that did arrive would be late and in insufficient quantities. The .50 caliber machine gun was both a cause and a symptom of American logistical superiority. It was effective because American industry could produce ammunition in vast quantities. It enabled sustained operations because its reliability meant that ammunition, once delivered, would be effectively employed. German soldiers observing American tracer fire arcing across the battlefield at night understood they were witnessing not merely ammunition expenditure, but the tangible proof of an industrial capacity they could not match. The terror from the air added another dimension to the German fear of the .50 caliber. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, which American pilots affectionately nicknamed the Jug, carried 8 Browning M2 machine guns in its wings. This meant a single fighter could deliver 4,400 rounds per minute of combined firepower during strafing runs. German ground forces learned to recognize the distinctive silhouette of the P-47 and the sound that heralded their demise. A strafing run by a flight of 4 P-47s meant 32 .50 caliber machine guns converging on a target area. The aircraft would approach at high speed and low altitude, often with minimal warning. Pilots would open fire at ranges of 600 to 800 meters and walk their fire across German positions, vehicles, and troop concentrations. The effect was described by survivors as a horizontal downpour of metal that left nothing intact. German supply sergeants who survived multiple strafing attacks during the retreat from Normandy in August 1944 described the helplessness German ground troops felt against American air power in their post-war interrogations. "You hear the engines first," one account read. "By the time you look up, they are already firing. The bullets hit the road, the vehicles, the men, all at once. There is no cover that works. Stone walls crumble, trees are cut down, metal tears like paper. You can be behind a truck one moment and the truck is gone the next. Just pieces of metal and fire." Soldiers learned to abandon vehicles the instant they heard aircraft engines. It was better to lose the vehicle than the vehicle and its crew. The P-47 proved particularly effective in what American pilots termed armed reconnaissance missions. Rather than targeting specific objectives, flights would patrol assigned sectors, actively seeking targets of opportunity. Any German vehicle moving during daylight hours risked attack, as did any troop column, supply convoy, or artillery position. The 850 caliber machine guns provided pilots with sufficient ammunition to engage multiple targets during a single sortie. A pilot might strafe a convoy, climb to altitude, spot a German tank platoon, dive to attack them, and then strafe a crossroads on the return flight. The ammunition reserves, estimated at approximately 425 rounds per firearm, totaled 3,400 rounds, providing sufficient capacity for prolonged engagements. German military units adjusted their tactics by predominantly operating under the cover of darkness and during inclement weather conditions. However, this strategic shift came at a significant detriment to their operational pace and logistical capabilities. Provisions that should have taken mere hours to transport now required several days. Reinforcements arrived either belatedly or not at all. The German Air Force's inability to challenge American aerial dominance by mid-1944 meant that ground troops operated under perpetual peril from air assaults. The principal instrument of this airborne threat was the .50 caliber machine gun. The combined application of .50 caliber fire, delivered from both ground emplacements and aircraft, created an effect of comprehensive suppression. German formations could not safely advance during daylight hours due to strafing attacks. They were equally unable to move securely at night, as American ground forces employed reconnaissance by fire, utilizing vehicle-mounted .50 caliber weapons to interdict roadways and pathways. They could not consolidate forces for counteroffensives because American military doctrine mandated the immediate engagement of any identified German formation with all available ordnance, including .50 caliber machine guns that could maintain a continuous barrage while other armaments were being brought into play. This was the reality that eroded German combat efficacy in the Western theater. It was not a singular decisive confrontation, nor a miraculous weapon, but rather the relentless pressure of facing an adversary whose standard heavy machine gun was deployed in such prodigious quantities and utilized so prodigiously that conventional military responses became rendered obsolete. German tactical planning, German combat training, German fighting spirit, none of these elements could surmount the stark mathematical certainty that American forces possessed the capability to deliver superior firepower to any point on the battlefield with greater alacrity than German units could respond. A German infantry battalion launching an assault against an American position might encounter 50 to 150 caliber machine guns, all firing incessantly, all provisioned with thousands of rounds of ammunition. German doctrine emphasized stringent fire discipline to conserve ammunition. Conversely, American doctrine advocated for overwhelming volumes of fire to suppress the enemy and maintain the initiative. When these divergent philosophies clashed, American material superiority proved to be the deciding factor. Urban warfare revealed an additional facet of the .50 caliber's potency. As American forces advanced through French towns and into German cities, the .50 caliber proved indispensable for neutralizing enemy strongholds within buildings and for demolishing fortified structures. Its substantial projectile possessed the capacity to penetrate multiple walls typical of European construction. Masonry that would withstand rifle and machine gun fire offered minimal impedance to .50 caliber rounds. American tank crews rapidly learned to leverage their turret-mounted .50 caliber machine guns to suppress enemy activity in upper-story windows and rooftop positions prior to advancing through urban areas. This tactic, though straightforward, was devastatingly effective, A tank would halt at a street intersection, and the commander would sweep the 50 caliber across building facades, firing continuously at any potential vantage point. The sustained barrage compelled German defenders to seek cover, thereby enabling infantry to advance. The tank would then proceed to the next intersection and repeat the procedure. German armored units, highly formidable in open terrain and particularly perilous in urban environments where they could engage opposing armor at close range, found themselves unable to operate effectively against American combined arms tactics that integrated 50 caliber suppressive fire. A Panzerfaust operator was compelled to expose himself to aim and discharge his weapon. American doctrine dictated continuous 50 caliber fire directed at any suspected enemy position. This combination rendered successful Panzerfaust engagements rare in scenarios where American forces adhered to proper combined arms coordination. German company commanders who engaged American forces along the Rhine during the concluding months of the war recounted their post-war memoirs the impossibility of mounting an effective defense in urban terrain against American tactics. German infantry would establish positions in upper-story rooms, affording clear fields of fire. American tanks would advance and reduce these buildings with 50 caliber fire and their main cannons. The 50 caliber rounds would penetrate walls and ceilings. There was no sanctuary. Soldiers would seek refuge behind furniture or interior walls, yet the projectiles would still locate them. The sole recourse for survival was to abandon positions before the Americans concentrated their fire. However, relinquishing positions meant conceding ground, and there was no further territory to cede. The psychological ramifications of combat within urban environments against an adversary possessing an inexhaustible supply of 50 caliber ammunition were profound. German soldiers intellectually comprehended that walls and structures offered concealment, but not absolute protection against 50 caliber ordnance. Emotionally, the innate human impulse to seek shelter behind solid objects was overwhelming. Witnessing 50 caliber rounds breach meter-thick stone walls and continue through multiple rooms shattered the psychological reassurance that shelter typically afforded. Soldiers felt vulnerable even when concealed, exposed even when shielded by what would ordinarily be considered adequate protection. This psychological degradation was cumulative. A soldier might survive one engagement, then another, but each time witnessing 50 caliber fire reduced what should have been secure cover. Ultimately, the accumulated stress stemming from the awareness that no position offered true security, that the Americans possessed the capacity and the intent to obliterate any defensive emplacement with sustained fire, eroded combat effectiveness. Units would vacate their positions without direct assault, knowing that American firepower would eventually render those emplacements untenable. The final campaigns waged in Germany unequivocally demonstrated the absolute supremacy of American firepower doctrine. German forces fought with valor and expertise, frequently achieving localized tactical successes against numerically superior American formations. However, tactical triumphs held no significance when American forces could simply concentrate overwhelming firepower and reduce German positions to rubble. The 50 caliber machine gun served as the bedrock of this immense firepower. It was available in sufficient numbers to engage any target. Its reliability was such that it could sustain continuous firing for extended durations. It was provisioned with an ample supply of ammunition, ensuring that American commanders never needed to ration their fire, and it was employed in accordance with a doctrine that prioritized suppression and destruction over conservation and precision. German tank crews developed a distinct apprehension of the .50 caliber machine gun for various reasons. While the M2 model lacked the capability to penetrate the frontal armor of German medium and heavy tanks, it could inflict damage on optical equipment, disable external stores, and suppress accompanying infantry. More critically, the .50 caliber possessed the ability to breach the thinner side and rear armor of numerous German armored vehicles at combat distances. American M10 tank destroyers were equipped with a .50 caliber M2 HB machine gun mounted on the rear of the turret, serving purposes of anti-aircraft defense and close-quarters infantry protection. Statistical analyses of ammunition expenditure revealed that M10 vehicles expended significantly more high-explosive shells than armor-piercing rounds, indicating extensive utilization in infantry support roles, where the .50 caliber proved crucial for what crews termed cleanup operations in confined spaces. A German panzer crew might disable an American tank, only to be annihilated by .50 caliber fire from accompanying tank destroyers or infantry support vehicles before they could effect an escape. Night combat introduced an additional layer of dread associated with the .50 caliber. American ammunition incorporated a ratio of 1 tracer round for every 4 ball rounds. This meant that every fifth .50 caliber projectile visible to the enemy was a luminous tracer, delineating the trajectory of the burst. German soldiers observing American .50 caliber fire during nighttime engagements could discern the luminous traces arcing towards their positions, streaks of light that appeared to move at a pace allowing for visual tracking, yet arrived with devastating velocity and impact. The psychological effect was profound. Soldiers could witness their impending demise. They could observe the tracers converging on their location. They understood that for every tracer they perceived, 4 additional projectiles were traveling along the identical path. The primal human instinct to duck or evade proved futile, as by the time a soldier registered the tracer, the rounds had already reached their destination. Veterans learned to avert their gaze from the tracers, but newly arrived replacements would fixate on them, entranced by the lethal spectacle, often freezing in the open until the fire found them. American forces deliberately exploited this psychological vulnerability. Nighttime reconnaissance by fire involved projecting streams of tracer-laden .50 caliber fire across suspected enemy positions. The visual impact was overwhelming. Entire sectors would illuminate with intersecting arcs of tracers. The cacophony of gunfire, coupled with the visual spectacle, created an environment that German soldiers characterized as hellish. German infantry squad leaders who were captured near Aachen in October of 1944 described their experiences in their post-war testimonies. At night, you can see them shooting even when they cannot see you. They fire at sounds, at movement, at nothing. The traces show you where death is coming from, and you cannot escape it. You watch the streams of fire and know that behind every tracer are 4 more bullets. You calculate that one gun firing for 10 seconds sends 50 rounds toward you, and only 10 are tracers. You see 10 streaks of light and know 40 more rounds are in the air. Then you realize there are not one but 5 or 10 guns firing. The mathematics of it are terrifying. You cannot survive that volume of fire by skill or courage. You survive by luck alone. The Germans possessed their own tracer ammunition, but their doctrine of fire discipline dictated its sparing use. A German machine gun crew might discharge a burst containing tracers to confirm their aiming point, subsequently switching to ball ammunition to conserve the more costly tracer rounds. American crews, conversely, employed mixed ammunition belts continuously. Consequently, the visual impression of American nighttime firepower was considerably more striking than its German counterpart, even when German weapons boasted superior rates of fire. This visual dominance had practical implications extending beyond mere intimidation. American commanders could monitor their own fire and make real-time adjustments. If tracers were falling short of a designated target, the gunner could perceive this and rectify the aim immediately. German counterfire was more challenging to assess due to their reduced use of tracers. As a result, American units received more immediate feedback regarding the efficacy of their fire, enabling them to refine their aim and concentrate their volleys with greater precision than German forces could achieve with their more conservative application of tracer ammunition. The Germans attempted to devise countermeasures. They endeavored to employ their armored vehicles more aggressively, aiming to close the distance with American positions before the .50 caliber fire escalated to overwhelming levels. This strategy rarely proved successful, as American artillery and air support would engage German armor at extended ranges, compelling the Germans to engage at precisely those distances where .50 caliber fire exerted its maximum effectiveness. They resorted to infiltration tactics, moving under the cover of darkness and adverse weather conditions when American observation capabilities were diminished. However, American logistical prowess ensured a perpetual supply of .50 caliber ammunition, and American doctrine encouraged the firing upon any suspected position, irrespective of whether targets were definitively confirmed. On July the 25th, 1944, during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy commenced with the deployment of 3,300 tons of ordnance dropped by 1,800 heavy bombers onto German positions in the vicinity of St. Lo. Major General Fritz Bain, commander of the Panzerlehr Division, an elite German formation defending the sector, provided his assessment of American firepower in extensive manuscripts prepared for the United States Army Historical Division after the war. His analysis of the campaign was clinical and devastating. He observed that by the time his division retreated from the St. Lo sector, it had been decimated not primarily by aerial bombardment or artillery, though these were significant contributing factors, but rather by the cumulative impact of relentless small arms fire that impeded his force's ability to maneuver effectively. The ubiquitous presence of American .50 caliber machine guns mounted on every vehicle meant that his troops could not advance to counter American incursions without immediately drawing fire. His conclusion was that the Americans had successfully resolved the fundamental challenge of modern warfare by devising a method to project superior firepower without necessitating superior training or tactical acumen. Bain, promoted to Lieutenant General on July 20, 1944, subsequently participated in the Ardennes Offensive, also known as the Battle of the Bulge and ultimately surrendered in April of 1945. His post-war writings became seminal sources for understanding German perspectives on American combat methodologies. He repeatedly noted that the 50 caliber machine gun, operated by personnel with minimal specialized training and supplied with vast quantities of ammunition, established a baseline of firepower that German forces were incapable of matching with their more sophisticated weaponry and better trained crews. The winter of 1944 witnessed the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's final significant offensive in the Western Theater. German forces achieved complete tactical surprise and initial success, and for the initial few days, it appeared plausible that German armor might achieve a breakthrough to the Meuse River, thereby bisecting the Allied armies. Subsequently, American logistical superiority reasserted itself, accompanied by the pervasive influence of the 50 caliber machine gun. American units rushing to the Ardennes carried their standard complement of ammunition and equipment. This meant that even ad hoc defensive positions could unleash devastating volumes of 50 caliber fire against German assaults. The engagement devolved into precisely the sort of attritional struggle that favored American material superiority. At Bastogne, surrounded American forces employed their 50 caliber machine guns with devastating effectiveness against German infantry assaults. The weapons functioned reliably despite temperatures well below freezing, the presence of mud and snow, and the general chaos of sustained combat. German forces committed a critical error in their strategic planning for the Bulge offensive. They assumed that inclement weather would ground American air power and diminish the effectiveness of American firepower. They were partially correct. Weather did initially impede air operations, but German planners had failed to account for the fact that ground-mounted 50 caliber machine guns were impervious to weather conditions and that American logistics could sustain ammunition expenditure at rates the Germans found incomprehensible. General der Fallschirmtruppe Alfred Schlemm commanded the 1st Parachute Army from November 1944 to March 1945, when he was wounded during Operation Veritable, the Canadian First Army's offensive across the Rhine. Schlemm faced the unenviable task of defending against Allied offensives with increasingly depleted resources and declining troop quality. His post-war analysis, akin to Bain's, centered on the cumulative psychological impact of American firepower. Schlemm observed that by early 1945, German soldiers had developed the ability to discern the sound of American 50 caliber fire from considerable distances. The knowledge that any position could be subjected to these weapons, that any movement could elicit immediate fire, and that German forces possessed no effective countermeasure, fostered what he termed a defensive mentality that rendered offensive operations virtually impossible. His forces successfully retreated across the Rhine prior to the final Allied push, but he attributed his casualties primarily to the relentless attrition inflicted by American heavy machine gun fire during the withdrawal. The technical specifications of the M2 Browning firearm shed light on its considerable effectiveness. The weapon weighed 84 pounds without its tripod and 128 pounds with the M3 tripod mount. While heavy, it was not excessively so for a crew-served weapon. Its effective range of 1,830 meters allowed it to engage targets far beyond the reach of German rifles and light machine guns. Its rate of fire, oscillating between 450 and 575 rounds per minute, was slower than that of the German MG-42. However, superior fire rates were rendered irrelevant when German crews faced ammunition constraints. The 50 caliber Browning machine gun cartridge utilized by the M2 possessed specifications that rendered it effective against a diverse array of targets. The standard M33 ball round achieved a muzzle velocity of 2,910 feet per second. Armor-piercing variants were capable of penetrating 19 millimeters of armor at 500 meters. The M8 API, armor-piercing incendiary round, could penetrate 16 millimeters of armor at 500 meters and would ignite fuel or ammunition upon impact. The M20 API variant, incorporating a tracer element, could penetrate 21 millimeters of armor at the same range. This implies that while the 50 caliber could not defeat the frontal armor of a Tiger or Panther tank, it was capable of penetrating the armor of half-tracks, armored cars, and the side and rear armor of numerous German armored vehicles. More significantly, it could disable truck engines, puncture fuel tanks, incapacitate artillery pieces, and suppress infantry at ranges where return fire was ineffective. The reliability of the M2 stemmed from its inherent design. John Browning had commenced its development in July of 1917 during the First World War. The M1921 water-cooled 50 caliber machine gun, weighing 121 pounds with its water jacket, entered service but proved excessively cumbersome for mobile warfare. The M2 air-cooled version, adopted in 1933, eliminated the water cooling system and reduced weight while preserving reliability. The fundamental operational principles of the weapon were straightforward, robust, and well-proven. American manufacturers, including AC Spark Plug, Frigidaire, Guide Lamp, and Colt, collectively produced nearly 2 million 50 caliber machine guns of all models throughout the war years. Production of the M2HB, the heavy barrel variant designed for sustained firing periods, reached an approximate total of 350,000 units across all branches of service and theaters of operation. This scale of production ensured that American forces never experienced a shortage of replacement weapons or spare parts. The Germans possessed an intellectual understanding of the challenge they faced. Their own weaponry was, in many respects, more sophisticated. The MG-34 and MG-42 were better suited for their role as squad automatic weapons. The German 13mm MG-131 aircraft machine gun boasted a higher rate of fire at 900 rounds per minute. German 20mm and 30mm aircraft cannons delivered more destructive impact per hit than any machine gun. However, technical sophistication proved inconsequential in the face of overwhelming material superiority. The Americans had developed a weapon that was sufficiently effective for every role it was intended to fulfill, and they had manufactured it in quantities that permitted its widespread deployment. Every American bomber carried 13 M2 models. Every fighter aircraft, such as the P-47 Thunderbolt, was equipped with 8 M2s. Every American combat vehicle was armed with at least one. American infantry companies were provisioned with organic 50 caliber heavy machine gun sections. American anti-aircraft units were able to repurpose their M16 quad mounts for ground combat engagements. The weapon was ubiquitous, perpetually available, consistently supplied with ample ammunition and functioned flawlessly whenever required. The psychological impact on German forces was cumulative and devastating. Individual soldiers might survive encounters involving 50 caliber fire. Units might successfully complete tactical objectives despite facing American firepower. However, over weeks and months of combat, the persistent awareness that the Americans could deploy overwhelming firepower against any target at any time with weapons that functioned reliably under all conditions wore down German combat effectiveness just as surely as casualties and equipment losses did. This was not an indication of cowardice on the part of German soldiers. These were veteran troops who had campaigned across Europe and North Africa. Many had confronted Soviet assaults on the Eastern Front, yet there was something uniquely demoralizing about the American approach to warfare. The Soviets might employ massed human waves and artillery. The British might demonstrate exceptional tactical prowess and coordination. The Americans, in contrast, simply deployed overwhelming material resources and engaged in sustained fire until resistance collapsed. German officers found it increasingly arduous to galvanize troops for assaults when they were aware that American 50 caliber firepower would confront any forward movement. German ground forces grew hesitant to maneuver during daylight hours. German armored vehicles opted to remain concealed rather than push onward. The advantage in strategic initiative irrevocably transferred to the Americans. This shift wasn't a consequence of superior battlefield strategies or enhanced troop conditioning, but rather because American military doctrine, underpinned by boundless ammunition reserves and dependable weaponry, rendered German doctrine obsolete. The animosity German soldiers harbored for the 50 caliber weapon mirrored the chagrin of artisans confronting mass production, of proficient combatants facing warfare waged on an industrial scale. The 50 caliber epitomized all that the Germans perceived as alien in American conflict. The nonchalant expenditure of munitions, the reliance on material supremacy over honed expertise, the inclination to obliterate rather than secure or circumvent. These approaches diverged significantly from the conventional methods of soldiers in the traditional European mold. Instead, they represented the tactics of an industrial giant that had concluded that material investment was more economical than human cost and more impactful than strategic subtlety. Following the conclusion of the war, German military scholars and former commanders offered concurrent evaluations. The American 50 caliber machine gun was not the pinnacle of World War II's weaponry. It did not boast the highest rate of fire, the greatest accuracy, the lowest weight, or the most varied applications. Its supremacy stemmed purely from its combination of unwavering dependability, widespread availability, and unparalleled logistical backing. The firearm itself constituted only one facet of the equation, the intricate system responsible for its manufacturing by the millions, its provisioning with billions of rounds of ammunition, and its deployment in accordance with a doctrine that embraced material spending as the requisite for triumph. It was this very system that proved instrumental in Germany's defeat. The lasting significance of the M2 Browning can be appreciated through its continued deployment. 80 years after its initial production, the weapon remains in active service with the United States military and armed forces across the globe. It has demonstrably outlasted every weapon system that stood against it during World War II. it has been a participant in every American engagement from World War II up to the present day. This enduring service life underscores the intrinsic soundness of its design and the efficacy of the American military philosophy it embodies. The broader strategic ramifications only became apparent in retrospect. German military planning had operated under the premise that superior training and tactical brilliance could counterbalance America's numerical superiority. This assumption proved to be disastrously incorrect. The .50 caliber machine gun exemplified that adequate weaponry, produced in overwhelming quantities and supplied without constraint, overshadowed sophisticated weapons manufactured in limited numbers and dispensed sparingly. German tank commanders, who had previously overcome Soviet armor through superior tactical acumen, found themselves incapable of maneuvering against American combined arms units that incorporated numerous .50 caliber machine guns. German infantry, who had mastered the intricate tactical nuances of the MG-42, discovered their expertise rendered irrelevant when American forces could simply blanket defensive positions with sustained .50 caliber volleys. German aviators, who had refined their skills against the Royal Air Force, were torn apart by defensive fire from bomber formations that prioritized volume over pinpoint accuracy. The lesson learned was universal and uncompromising. In the context of industrial warfare, the side capable of sustaining a higher level of material expenditure will emerge victorious, irrespective of disparities in tactical skill. The Germans had approached a war of mass production with a craftsman's mindset. They had focused on efficiency when the situation demanded overwhelming force. They had rationed ammunition when their adversaries could afford to discharge it freely. What German soldiers learned through harsh experience was that modern industrial warfare favors not strategic ingenuity or superior conditioning, but the capacity to sustain overwhelming material outlay. The M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun became the emblem and the instrument of this revelation. German forces brought proficiency, strategic planning, and determination to the field of battle. American forces deployed an industrial infrastructure capable of generating and supplying heavy machine guns in volumes that rendered opposition mathematically futile. When these two distinct approaches to warfare clashed, the outcome was never truly in doubt.